Hi everybody, this is Mike, and GenerateBlocks is officially out, and I had a good question about the grid, and I thought it would be best to make a quick video on how it works and how I've been using it to create responsive layouts and the way it works as far as kind of reflowing content as it starts stacking responsively. So I'm just going to build out something really quick on the fly, and then I also have a pricing table saved as a reusable block that I'm going to show you kind of a better way to work with odd column, like 3-column stuff responsively to make it look a little better. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop in a container because I want to be able to show you the grid containers on top of the background color, which will make the spacing a little more clear to see and how things space when they stack. Alright, so this is just a container. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to give it a little more padding, and I'm going to drop a background color in it, and I'll use that. Okay, so this page is actually using GeneratePress, the full width layout element. So this container is going to stretch the full width of the browser. So if you were to put a background photo in here, you would get a photo as wide as your browser. And then the grid is going to sit inside, and it's going to be contained. And this side I have to 1200 pixels as far as the contained content. Alright, so now basically when you go to the block navigation, all I have is a GenerateBlocks container. So I'm going to drop in a grid. And what I'm going to do is build a 4-column kind of info boxes. And you would think that I need a 4-column grid, but things like info boxes and pricing tables, they're all the same. So usually when you design one, you just want to duplicate it. So instead of adding this one and then having to delete the 3 empty containers to duplicate the first one that I designed, I'm just going to grab one container. And then I'm just going to go ahead and when I go, I have a container, here's my grid, so here's my container inside my grid. This is 100% right now on desktop because I chose one container, but I'm going to make it 25. And then when I'm done designing this little info box, I'll just duplicate it 3 times to fill out the 4 that go across as far as desktop. So this container, I'm going to give it a background color because I think that's the best way, like I said, to show the contrast between the container background color. You'll be able to see the spacing a lot easier than if everything was all white. So I'm going to need some padding inside this container so that my content doesn't touch the edges, and I'm going to make the background color just white. And then maybe I'll give it little round corners there like that. And then I'm going to throw in a headline, and I'll just write headline. And the headline block comes in by default as an H2. I'm going to change that, make it a little smaller as H4. I've got some text down here I'm going to drop in the just the core paragraph block. And then I have a reusable button block that I'm going to grab here from my reusable block section. And if you haven't used the reusable blocks, they're basically like templates. You keep them in here in the reusable block area. But when you drop them in, it's still tied to it. So if I were to change the reusable block, it's going to change this one. And I can't actually edit this one because it's still linked back to that master reusable block. So this would be good if, like say you built an email sign-up form and saved it as a reusable block. You can drop it into each page because you know you're not going to edit it on page. And that way if you were to change it in the reusable block section, it would change everywhere it is on the site. So it's basically like a linked master block. But since I'm going to need to change this, I'm just going to go ahead, and the way to break the connection to the reusable block is to convert it to a regular block. So now I have my container, my grid, and then this is the 25% container. I've got a headline, paragraph, I've got the button container, and then the actual button inside of it. And the way that works is the button container, if you were to have multiple buttons side by side or stacked, they all sit inside this button container. So you'll see different options when you're on the container, which will be like alignment. You can make the button, I'll make this really quick, wider so you can see what I mean. So when you click on the button, you're going to get all the typical styling options, but when you click the actual container, you're going to see here, you're going to get alignment options. You're going to be able to fill the width of the container, like maybe for a pricing table. If I had two buttons, I could go ahead and I could have them side by side. I could add some space in there, or I could stack them vertically and add some space between them. So that's how kind of the button container relates to the actual buttons. But since I'm just using one, I'm going to go ahead and make that back to 25%. Okay, so a real quick preview. So far I've got this background color. I put 100 pixels of padding on the top and the bottom. And I'm telling you that because I'm going to show you why or how the vertical gap affects that. And I have my little info box here. So if I go back and I say, okay, I like this info box, then I'm basically just, I'm going to duplicate it 3 more times to get my little four little info boxes. Okay. Now if I wanted to increase the space in the middle, I could go ahead and I could basically change the horizontal gap. And always keep in mind which device you're on, because right now I'm adjusting desktop. So make sure desktop is checked. And let's say I make this 50 to add a little gap there. Now the way the grid works, it's based off of Flexbox. So if I were to, these are all 25%, which obviously adds up to 100%. So anything more than this, it's going to flow to the next line. So if this last one, if I made this 33%, you're going to see it goes past 100% and it's going to drop down. So basically anything that's going to equal 100% is going to flow. So it basically goes left, right, and then down, and then left, right, and then down. So if you wanted 2 rows of 4 info boxes, like 4 on the top and then 4 below, you wouldn't need to make a 4 container grid and then duplicate the grid. You would just make one grid with 8 containers in it, 8 info boxes, and then they would just basically flow down. And that way when you change it for, say, tablet, and say on tablet you wanted it 2, 2, 2, 2, they would all just flow. Basically you would make them 50% each, and then you would basically have 2, the next 2 would drop down, the next 2 would drop down. And it's better to do it that way because they're all connected. So if you did a grid of 4 and then duplicated a grid to have another 4 below it, they wouldn't be connected, and it would kind of break that flow that the grid allows you to do, as far as all of them being connected and them flowing based on how wide they are and what device they are. So I'm going to bring this guy back up, and I'll show you while I'm in here real quick. When you're on the grid, the vertical gap for desktop, you would only use that if you had some kind of stack. So I have a stack here, so I'm going to go ahead, and a vertical gap is going to control the spacing between containers that flow below any row. So when you go past one row and something drops to the next, that's where you would add the vertical gap on desktop. But since I'm just going to keep 4 on desktop, I don't need the vertical gap, because, and like I explained, when I put the 100 pixel padding, it's going to add 50 pixels. I had set it, so that means there would be 100 pixels of padding up here. But if I left the vertical gap on desktop with only 1 row of containers, then down here would be 150 pixels. And I'll show you how, when you start using them responsively, how to individually turn off to get rid of that gap that you don't need on certain containers. All right, so as of right now, I've got these 4. I've got 100 pixels here. I've got 100 pixels down here. And you don't have to obviously make them even. You know, if I made this one 50, obviously it's going to push that 4th one down to the next level. you don't have to make them exact. You could actually use the slider. So based on your content, if you wanted certain line breaks or your content to fit a certain area, you can go ahead and just adjust it this way, and you'll notice everything just kind of flows. So if I were to go ahead and just keep, everything's gonna, like I said, once it gets past 100% in each row, it's gonna drop down to the next level. All right, so I'm back to 4 25% info boxes. Okay, one thing I'll show you is, you'll notice when I made this guy wider, obviously the text is going to come up, which means that these are going to be taller because they're narrower. But you'll notice that I have this huge white gap here. All right, so when you look at it on desktop now, you're wondering why is this big white gap here? It's because by default, the containers in the same row are going to match the height of the tallest one. So this guy is stretching to be able to match the height of these two. Now the way around that, if you wanted it to not fill that height, is when you go back to your grid, this vertical alignment, the default option does that. It'll basically make them all the same height. But if you pick any one of these, it'll go ahead and remove it. So if I do bottom, you'll notice that it crops it, and then it's going to align them all at the bottom. If I did center, it's going to crop it and align them this way. And if I click top, obviously it's going to align everything at the top, and then this will just be cropped. So that's one way to align stuff that isn't even. All right, so let me bring this guy back to 25%, and I've got these 4 again. Okay, so if I'm happy now that this is, I've got 4 on desktop, and because it's a nice even number, I could just say, okay, on tablet, I'm going to want 2 and 2. So basically, I'll just make all these 50% on tablet. And then that way, I can go over here in the GenerateBlocks Customizer, and when I click on tablet, you'll notice now I've got 2 and 2. And you'll also notice that they're touching. So that means when I go back to the grid and I select tablet, because that's what I'm working on, I need to add a vertical gap. So I'll go ahead and I'll add that, update it. And then when I refresh this, now I have a 50 pixel vertical gap between them. But you'll also notice now I have 150 pixels down here. And it's because when they stacked like this, I know that the first 2 needed the gap below it, but number 3 and 4 don't, because these are bottom facing. So you basically always want to just think, okay, which, based on the layout, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4 columns, which ones are going to be bottom facing, because those are the ones I'm going to want to remove the vertical gap on. And the way to do that is I'm going to go to the 3rd one, which doesn't need it. I'll make sure I'm on tablet, and I'll remove that vertical gap. And then the same with the 4th one. I'll remove that vertical gap. And then that way when I go back, I've got 100 pixels here. I've got the gap coming off 1 and 2, but on 3 and 4 it's turned off, so then I have another even 100 pixels down here on the bottom. Okay, so if you take it now to the next level, which is mobile, everything's going to default to 100%. And the same premise, when I get to mobile, I'm going to look at how they stack, and I'm going to say, okay, now that they're all on top of each other, I definitely want the vertical gap on 1, 2, and 3, but this time I don't want it on 4. So basically the 4th one is the only one I would want to turn that gap off. So that means number 3 has it turned off on tablet, but on mobile I actually need it because it's going to be above number 4. But number 4, I do not need the vertical gap on mobile. And then you can go ahead and you'll notice you're going to get a nice little space between each one, and then the last one it's removed so it's all even, and you've got perfect little mobile layout. Alright, so that's basically how the grid works. And like I said, you don't have to have even columns. You could have, if you had these 4, you can make, column 1, 50%, You can make these two 25, make this one 100 on desktop, and then on tablet you could do whatever you want. There's no, it's really, the possibilities are endless as far as layouts based on how you want to show your content on desktop versus tablet versus mobile. And one other cool thing is, say I remove this guy and I have these three, which total 75%. You don't have to fill the 100%. So if I go back and look now, I've got these three, and you'll notice they didn't fill the width. This is that open 25%. Now, if you wanted to not use the whole width of the row, say you wanted to, here, I'll delete this one here. I'll even delete this one here. And let's say this was an email sign-up form that I wanted 50%. And let's say even on desktop I wanted it 50% wide. Because usually when you have like an email sign-up form, you don't want it the whole width of the browser. So I've got this email sign-up form, and it's sitting here in the middle, and it's eating up 50% of the space, but I want it to float in the middle. You can go on the grid, and that's where your horizontal alignment is going to show up. So basically, any container you have in a row that's not using the whole 100%, you can go ahead and set it to align. Well, let me jump back to desktop because I was on tablet. So you could set it to align, and then what's going to happen is it's going to float in the middle. So that's a good way if you have some kind of content or section that you don't want the full width, to have it sit in the middle of the page. And you could even actually have it, if you wanted it to float right, you can go ahead and do that as well. All right, so one other example I'll show you is I have this pricing table saved in my reusable blocks, and I'll grab it. All right, so I've got this little pricing table, and I'm going to go ahead and convert it to break the connection to the reusable block. And here we have it on desktop, and it is 3 columns. And I'll show you what I've been doing as far as, when you get to tablet, and I'll show you really quick how that looks. Pricing tables sometimes can get weird like this, like they're too narrow, and it just looks kind of bizarre. So you would think, okay, well, I'm just going to, because it's an odd number, I can't really make them 2 and 2, so I'm just going to make each one 100%. But that can kind of get weird looking as far as having a full width pricing table, and I'll show you what that looks like just as reference. So when I go here now, I have these pricing tables, but they look kind of strange because, here's the content, but they are spanning the full width. It looks weird. And you'll see I need to add the vertical gap on these as well. So what I've been doing is, basically, I'll take the first column on tablet, and I might make it anything more than 50%, because once you hit 100%, 101%, the second one is going to fall down. So if I made this one, say 51%, I'll just make it, for now, I'll just make it 55%. And then I'll make these two 55% as well. That's going to force them to stack, but at the same time, they're not going to be the full width of the tablet. And the other thing I want to do is I want to make sure that, because they're only going to be 55% the width, I'm going to want them to float in the center, or else they'll be off on one side. And then also on tablet, I'm definitely going to want a vertical gap. And I'm going to want vertical gap on number 1 and number 2, but not on number 3, because the third one is going to be the last one, and it's going to be bottom facing, so I don't want that 150 pixel spacing. So I need vertical gap here, I need it here, but at the same time I want to remove it on this last one. And so then when I jump onto tablet, my pricing table is condensed, it looks better, and I've got some space between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, and then this last one, it's basically has the same padding as the top, the 100 pixels. So that's kind of a better way of laying out stuff with odd columns on tablet. And then obviously when you hit mobile, you're basically going to get pretty much the same thing. And you'll notice this looks a little bigger, which means that on mobile, I need to turn the vertical gap off as well, because this is the last one. So basically this last one is going to have the vertical gap turned off on mobile and tablet. And there you go. So basically I have 3. And one other thing I'll show you is when you're, some people they'll do their base plan, and then they'll do their kind of enterprise plan, and then in the middle they'll do that kind of best value, which is the one you're kind of targeting people to buy. It's that whole philosophy of with 3 choices, they'll pick the one in the middle. Now let's say that this, because it has this little best value star here, is a little taller. So when you're on the grid, that's where the vertical alignment would come in. So if I wanted all of my buttons to line up, I'm going to align it to the bottom. Oh, and see, I was on tablet, so I always got to make sure that I'm on the right one. So I'm going to line it to the bottom, and that way you'll notice the best value is up here. These are aligned, and then my buttons are all aligned on the bottom. Now if you wanted to, just for, let's say I duplicate one of these and I duplicate one of these, and I go ahead and kind of shuffle these around. So now that this middle plan has more features, now you're going to have kind of substantially more height. So even though they're still aligned at the bottom, this guy is kind of sticking out the top. One thing you can do is go back to the grid, and if you center align them, you'll notice you'll get this middle featured one, which will be kind of sticking out higher, and it'll also be sticking out a little lower on the bottom. So you could do something like that to make it look a little more prominent and kind of like, hey, this is the one you want to buy. So you could align them that way. So you could align the buttons, you could align the headers, however you want to do it. And then obviously you could change, if you didn't want to do, if you actually wanted to do 3 on tablet, you didn't want to stack them like I just did before. You basically, on desktop, you could have a nice little gap here. But to keep 3 on tablet, you might maybe change this to like 10. And then what that would do is when I go back and I create on desktop, they're 33. So I'm gonna say, you know what, on tablet I do want them to be all together and not stacked. I'll set them to a 1/3 on tablet as well. And then that way when you get to the tablet page, they'll be closer together. 10 might be kind of pushing it. Let me go back and maybe make it 20. And that way you can keep them on together. They're still a little condensed, but if your plan looks better that way, like if you have maybe some shorter sentences or smaller type, you might be able to get all 3 on tablet by kind of condensing the space between them. Because these did have 100 pixels, which is obviously going to eat up way more horizontal space. So you can mess around with, based on how your pricing tables look, how big your type is, how much text you have in each one. You can always just go ahead and mess around with the spacing that way. So I hope that kind of gives you a better idea of how the grid works. I wanted to make this kind of short and sweet. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask below. If you haven't subscribed, please do. I'm going to start working on the other blocks, making kind of short little videos, different ways you can use them. And then eventually GenerateBlocks Pro is going to have a whole kind of library of block patterns and pre-built stuff. And I'm going to start making some short videos on how you can use those and some other stuff. So everybody, thanks for watching and stay safe, and I hope everyone has a great day.